and welcome to a brand new episode of Beyond the Indus. And this month, we're going to continue with our ongoing series called The Road to 24, where we analyze the different political blocs that are going to compete in the upcoming Indian election in April and May of this year. Last month, we covered the BJP led by Narendra Modi, and we discussed his election campaign, strategy, and how well they perform on the ground. So please do watch that if you haven't already. But this month, we're going to be talking about the opposition. In response to the electoral juggernaut that the BJP led by Modi has become, the opposition hasn't stood still. Its response is to coalesce itself into a grand opposition alliance called the Indian National Developmental Inclusive Alliance, or India for short. And we're going to explore the India bloc, how this bloc came about, what makes it different from previous pre-poll alliances, and how fairly they can compete in India's current electoral environment, whether the playing field is level or not. We're going to be speaking with Professor Gilles Vernier about the India bloc's chances and the caste and regional arithmetic that might see them dent the BJP's majority. But before that, we have to address the elephant in the room, and that's the grand old party of India, the Indian National Congress. The Congress's electoral performance since 2014 has been lackluster at the national level, and even though it's the largest opposition party that anchors the India alliance, it's been plagued by organizational and leadership challenges that might make it difficult for it to effectively challenge Narendra Modi. So for the first part of our episode, we're going to be speaking to Snigdhendu Bhattacharya to dissect the Indian National Congress, talking about its history, its recent challenges, and its prospects for the next election as part of the India bloc. Stay tuned. So joining us today to explain the Indian National Congress and its history is Snigdhendu Bhattacharya. Snigdhendu is an independent journalist who writes on India's politics, history, environment, human rights, and culture since 2005. He's authored two books, Mission Bengal, A Saffron Experiment, and Lalgarh and the Legend of Kishanji, Tales from India's Maoist Movement. And his articles have been featured in The Wire, HuffPost India, Nikkei Asia, Hindustan Times, and The Times of India, amongst many, many others. Snigdhendu takes a special interest in the northeast of the Indian subcontinent, so in northeast India, Bengal, and Bangladesh. And he's written several articles for The Diplomat following the election, including about electoral bonds, the cohesion of the opposition, etc. So, Snigdhendu, welcome to Beyond the Indus, and thanks for joining the podcast.
Hi, hello, my pleasure.
Right. I guess during this interview, what we're going to do is focus on the largest party in the opposition, the party that has, dominated Indian politics, since independence to at least the late 1980s, and that's the Indian National Congress. So I guess most people who are familiar with India might already know that the Indian National Congress has sort of dominated India's electoral politics after independence. It is, of course, a party that, led India to freedom, or at least contributed substantially to it. And what was curious is, post the 1980s, I think in 1984, after the assassination of Indira Gandhi, it secured something like 400 plus seats in the parliament. And in the decades since, it's been sort of losing its dominance, steadily. So could you maybe break down what were the factors behind its decline post the 1980s? And, its transformation from the sort of unitary party that could secure majorities on its own to its sort of more coalition-based electoral approach. How did that process take place?
To understand the party's decline in the post-1980 scenario, you will have to know a bit about the pre-1980s situation and how Congress came to be such a dominant force in the first place, because in pre-independence India, all identities, all regional identities, religious identities, every other identity was united under the Indian identity, and the platform was the Congress. So when in Congress, India was independent, Congress was national, and the single biggest platform of all forces, and they had the dominance. There were two main ideological opponents. One was the Hindu nationalists, and the other were the left parties, the Communist Party, and there was a third ideological opposition, that was the socialists, the Social Democrats. So 50s and 60s, these three forces started getting a bit from Congress's support base. But the major changes happened in the 70s, and it is when there was a lot of reorganization in the political alignment in the opposition front. And the biggest of the developments was the rise of the regional party. So this identity, the very identity, Indian identity, that had brought everybody under the Congress's umbrella, had started making way for regional identities. And these regional identity-based political parties, they started reaching into Congress's support base in different regions.
I see.
From the 1980s onwards, these regional forces became more dominant. These parties became dominant in large states like Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Karnataka, and southern identity-based parties became influential in Tamil Nadu, in Andhra Pradesh. This is how, by the beginning of 90s and mid-90s, regional forces had become so important and so powerful that there was definitely three different fronts in India. One was the Congress-led political front, which speaks of secularism, inclusiveness, etc. The second was this Hindu nationalist camp led by the BJP. And the third was the consolidation of regional forces. And in the 1996 Lok Sabha election, and these regional forces managed to form power, keeping both BJP and Congress out of power. Their government continued for 2 years only with two prime ministers, because ultimately these regional parties could not stay together because there was no common ground to stick them together. And that gave rise to the Hindu nationalists as the other alternative of the Congress.
Yeah, I see. And it's interesting because you mentioned the rise of regional parties, and both the dominant national parties, that's the Congress and the BJP, had to adapt to that by setting up coalition governments. But to move on to the 2004 government, where the UPA, that was a Congress alliance, led the party to victory, it was sort of a new avatar of the Congress. You know, it was a sort of broad coalition of alliance partners where the Congress was still dominant. It had a well-respected Prime Minister, Manmohan Singh, and it maintained a stable government, unlike the 90s. And even in the first term, it was seen to be performing pretty well in terms of economic growth, in terms of the legislation it brought in, its foreign relations. But in its second term, things started to unravel. And it's widely argued that it's part of that reason, not just because of Modi's popularity, it's a Congress's perceived failure in its second term that led to the BJP's surprise majority. So maybe could you talk about the previous UPA government that the Congress led and how the legacy of that government is shaping the perception of the Congress today?
So in 2004, when the Vajpayee government, the BJP failed to get a majority, even the left parties, the CPIM and others, they came forward to support the Congress. Now, the CPIM, these left parties, they have always maintained a different distance from the Congress. They have been critical of the Congress in economic policies, and so they didn't become a part of the government. They didn't join the government, but they did support the government from outside. And it was during these, this left was part of it for 4 years. They withdrew in 2008 on the question of the atomic energy agreement with America, with the US. But during these 4 years, a lot of progressive changes came in the legislation. Tribal rights were acknowledged. Right to information was a big improvement on transparency question. I think the right to education was also passed during this period. The first term, they managed to do well. The second time, they started to falter right from the beginning. And it's quite strange. And it was also the time when the left-wing insurgency in India had a rise. A vast range of India's forest land became a virtual conflict zone between Indian security forces and the ultra-left rebels of the Communist Party of India, Maoists. And at the same time, some security problems appeared in Kashmir also. There was a sudden rise in insurgencies in Kashmir. So on the one hand, there was Congress's own weaknesses in handling the government, which ultimately gave the BJP the space to exploit. And these factors all came together to bring the Congress government down, the UPA 2 government down.
Right. And, just to press you on that question, because the one thing I vividly remember about UP2 was the sort of tag of corruption that the Congress attracted or the UP attracted. You had several of these so-called corruption scams. You had the coal scam, you had the 2G scam, I believe. So what role do you think the perception of corruption and scams had in weakening the UPA government, UP2 government, I should say?
For UPA2, the perception of corruption was a big thing. People don't usually bring down a government only because it is found to be corrupt. But in case of Congress, there was not only this series of allegations, but there was another thing and a very crucial experiment that the RSS did at that time. That was to launch that anti-corruption movement with Anna Hazare at its center. At that time, people considered it to be an apolitical move, but it has become evident over the last 10 years and from comments by senior RSS leaders and also their literature that the entire anti-India against corruption movement that happened in Delhi for years seeking the Lokpal bill.
It's like ombudsman run by civil society. I guess that was a general idea.
Yeah. But now it has become very clear, and because top RSS functionaries have admitted it in different places, that this entire thing was supported by the RSS, that it was orchestrated by the RSS. They brought into the Indian political sphere in the large scale the idea of a political movement with a full political background. We have seen apolitical movements, civil society movements found in governance, like in West Bengal in 2011. Here, it was experimented at the largest scale, at the national scale, and not by the centrist or the leftist, but by a rightist party, who kept an apparently unsuspecting social activist in France to engineer everything from behind. And this India Against Corruption movement played the biggest role in creating the perception of corruption, because the entire machinery of the RSS worked from behind to spread the message through social media channels, while the television channel and the mainstream media was already getting it covered. So that kind of orchestration worked for 2 to 3 years to build that perception, that anti-corruption perception. That's why it is one of the rare cases where the perception of corruption played a vital role in bringing down.
So that's fascinating because, as our listeners might remember, we covered the RSS and the BJP last episode. And the RSS is, like you said, the BJP's ideological organization. But more importantly, they have perhaps one of the strongest nationwide ground level organizations of volunteers. And this is one of the primary reasons why the BJP has such an organized campaign. And I think in American terms, they call it ground game. So that's fascinating that they helped orchestrate the so-called anti-corruption movement that led to the Congress's downfall. Coming to post the 2014 election and the Congress trying to revive itself, one of the accusations that I've heard a lot, that's thrown at the Congress a lot, is that it's a dynastic party, that it's had a Nehru or a Gandhi at the head of its organization for almost the entire post-independence history. And the accusation is that it's this that has contributed to its parliamentary ineffectiveness and lackluster performance and position and a declining position, in fact, in the Indian polity. Stigler, to what extent is this accusation accurate, and to what extent does this reflect the Congress's electoral decline post-2014?
Well, Congress has certainly turned into a dynastic party, which it wasn't supposed to be, because it was India's biggest national platform. A platform which, at a point of time, included everyone, from the leftists to the right conservatives to right liberals and to centrists. And it had strong regional leaders everywhere. For some reason, Nehru was able to bring a balance between the varying interests that Congress always did. Big industrialists were its donors, and the biggest trade union also belonged to the Congress. These kinds of various interests were there. Once Nehru was no more, there was no one to keep Congress integrated. Shastri was there, as well after Shastri's death. This battle of capturing Congress started. And there, some of Congress's old guards, they thought that better than some of my rival or some of my contemporary, why not give Nehru's daughter a chance? They brought Indira Gandhi to the forefront. Then Indira Gandhi became Indira Gandhi. She became what she became. But she was not destined to be the prime minister because Nehru didn't believe in dynasty politics. But after Indira Gandhi had taken the role, and after she was in 1984, Congress again chose Rajiv Gandhi. By the 1970s, it was evident that, and especially with the appointment of Rajiv Gandhi as his successor, who was not in politics at all. So it shows the basic characteristics of Congress. The character of Congress is that, many Congress leaders describe it as the crab mentality. What is the crab mentality? Crab mentality is, if I can't climb up, I will not let you climb up. If one leader sees other leaders are climbing up, going higher up the hierarchy, they will try to break. That's how it's the Congress culture that entrusted the party to our dynasty. And now Congress can't get out of it. Even now, we can see that there is a non-Gandhi president after a long time, Mr. Mallikarjun Kharge. But everybody knows that it is Rahul Gandhi who matters, and it is Sonia Gandhi who matters. At the end of the day, for any dispute, the final word will have to come from a Gandhi.
We talked a lot about the weaknesses of the Congress, but I think I want to introduce a point of dissension because the Congress is actually winning states. It's not at all terrible performance in the Indian states, even with the, let's say, underhanded tactics that the BJP sometimes implements post-elections in states. The Congress has done well. It's formed governments in Karnataka and Telangana. Until recently, it had governments in Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, and Chhattisgarh, which are Hindi heartland states. So what accounts for its strength in the state elections? Why is it being able to perform much better in Indian states as compared to its performance at a national level, let's say?
Yeah, the reason is the Modi fact. In the regional elections, BJP, in most cases, BJP's local leaders are losing out to Congress's local leaders. And or other regional forces. Wherever BJP is facing defeat, it is mostly regional defeat because of the presence of strong regional leaders. These strong regional leaders are sometimes from other parties, regional parties, sometimes from the Congress. But at the national level, right now, there is no one figure which can be considered to be compatible to take on PM Modi. So in every election, if we closely analyze the voting trends of every state, every region, in the regional election and in the national election, we will see that the BJP's vote share increases in the national election by 3 to 4, even 5 to 6 percentage points, which is a significant increase. Well, it's the national level. So the same people are voting for Modi in larger number, for voting for BJP in larger number, when the question is Modi. And the same people are voting for BJP in a lesser number, when the question is a regional need.
Right. And the elections happening is going to start from next month. It's going to go on until May. And the BJP is widely expected to come back to power. The question of their majority is up in the air, but they're predicted to be the single largest party. So in the long run, maybe you could give us an idea of how do you expect the Congress to perform in the next election? Do you think they'll do better? Do you think they'll lose even more seats than they have? But also in the long run, how do you see the Congress evolving as a national party? You mentioned the state leaders, the strong state leaders. Are they going to play a part? Do you expect maybe leadership or organizational changes, maybe a non-Gandhi head at some point? Or do you see it fading away in the long run to give way to some, coalition of regional parties or, maybe another party to take the place it has in the left? How do you see the Congress evolving?
The Congress has been trying to fight an ideological battle, and at the same time, at the regional level, they're trying to show good governance, and they're trying to rise from grassroots. Only time can tell how much they will manage to convince people that they can offer a stable government. an alternative, a stable alternative to Mr. Modi. Uh, how it remains to be seen. But it would be too early to write them completely off, because in 2004 also no one expected Congress to return to power. But it is the same South India, which brought Indira Gandhi back to power in 1980. It is the same South India that brought UPA one to power in 2004. It is the same South India that can again back the Congress. So a lot of arithmetics and chemistry is there to discuss, and it is really difficult to predict right at this moment. Elections can always bring surprises.
Brilliant. And you're right. Indian elections can always surprise even the most veteran observers. So, Snigdhendu, thank you so much for giving our listeners an understanding of the Congress. And I'll be watching the election. I know you'll be too. So, yeah, thanks a lot for joining the podcast.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
As of today, most forecasters are predicting that the BJP will come back to power and possibly retain their majority in the Lok Sabha. And as we've seen, the Congress alone isn't really in a position to challenge them. But Indian politics isn't like a US presidential election. It's not just about two main parties, but rather the vast and diverse range of smaller regional parties that can make all the difference. And a substantial chunk of these smaller opposition parties are coming together to form a grand opposition alliance called the Indian National Developmental Inclusive Alliance, or INDIA, India abbreviated, anchored by the Indian National Congress and consisting of 40 parties from all corners of India. The question remains whether their combined efforts can put a stop to the Modi-led BJP electoral juggernaut. And to help us break that down, we have with us today Professor Gilles Vernier. Professor Vernier is a senior fellow at the Center of Policy Research, New Delhi, and a Karl Löwenstein Fellow and visiting assistant professor at Amherst College. Having received his PhD in political science from Sciences Po in 2016, Professor Vernier has been based in India and has been visiting there since 2005, and until recently was the founder and co-director of the Trivedi Center for Political Data at Ashoka University, one of India's leading private universities. Professor Vernier's work focuses on questions of political representation and the intersections of caste, community, gender, and religion within the Indian electorate. He's led efforts to build public datasets on Indian elections and political actors, and I think is the perfect person to help us understand at a granular level the electoral arithmetic of the opposition alliance. So, Professor Vernier, welcome to Beyond the Indus, and thanks for joining the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So, Professor Vernier, just to get you started, the so-called the India Alliance, it purports to be this grand coalition of non-BJP parties across India. Maybe could you help us understand what was the genesis of this alliance and who are the current and perhaps the former members, because the alliance has splintered here and there, and how does it also differ from previous pre-poll alliances like the UPA or the NDA?
Okay, so the India Alliance, the genesis of the India Alliance, came out from the realization that only a unified opposition could throw a challenge at the BJP. The BJP since 2014 has a single majority of its own in the Indian Parliament, and it has a number of advantages, comparative advantages against its main opponent, the other national party, the Congress Party. So from the Congress point of view, it needs allies to take on the BJP since it does not have the strength to go after it, on its own. One piece of statistics that's relevant here is that whenever a BJP and a Congress candidate were face to face in a constituency since 2014, the BJP won 90% of the time. So the coalition, the alliance rather, was born out of that necessity of pulling the opposition together in order to counter the BJP. It's not entirely different from alliances of the past. Because pre-electoral alliances in India are essentially that, pre-electoral alliances, parties getting together, coming to seat-sharing agreements, and producing some sort of a common platform to challenge their adversaries. One major difference, though, is that the India Alliance has not succeeded in coming up with a detailed or even precise, platform, or even build a counter narrative to the BJP at the head of the NDA alliance. In the past, pre-electoral alliances would publish a common manifesto. They would have, a common minimum program that they would sort of agree on even before fighting the elections, even though there would be a lot of renegotiation after that. But here you have a collection of political parties that got together, but they've yet to achieve political or programmatic cohesion.
Right. And, the last episode we did was on the BJP. And we have generally a good idea of what their campaigns are like. We've seen two campaigns before in 2014 and 2019. We've seen state campaigns. And obviously, they have the vast resource of the RSS cadre to undertake their ground game. But it's not clear how the India Alliance is planning to run its campaign in terms of their issues, in terms of what resources they can help each other with. What is their election strategy? What issues are they running on? And maybe as an addendum, how cohesive are they as an alliance, apart from the fact that they want to defeat the BJP?
So the BJP narrative is quite cohesive and rely on a combination of potent political tropes: nationalism, pride in the assertion of India as a major power, Hindu majoritarianism, welfare, inclusion. And as a result, the opposition is reluctant to fight the BJP on what are its perceived strengths, which does not leave a lot of ground. Really, I mean, the real distinct element of program in the India Alliance platform is social justice and caste-based justice, the idea of a census, which are not ideas that have been electorally strong in even in recent elections. And so for the past 6 months or so, the different members of the India Alliance have been essentially talking to each other, trying to negotiate seat-sharing agreements, and not with a great deal of success. But they haven't spent that time thinking about what they would really say to voters, which gives an impression of disorganization, of disarray, lack of cohesion, which is compounded by the fact that some major parties of that alliance have left it already. The Janata United and Nitish Kumar, who quite spectacularly went back to the BJP a couple of months ago. Even a senior member of the coalition who publicly expressed doubts about the fate of the alliance. So, this is making this election fairly non-competitive. Something we need to remember also is that alliance is constrained by membership and by electoral geography. So you've mentioned in your introduction that the India Alliance contains 40 parties, but most of these parties currently don't hold representations and are really micro parties that don't have a vocation of actually making a difference. Right now, the India Alliance members hold 122 seats, which is a little less than 24% of the seats in parliament, while the BJP and its partner have a strong majority. So that helped to understand the distance that separates them. Then the main components of the India Alliance are essentially from states where the BJP is not yet strong or even present, mostly in the south and along the east of the country. So the BJP is building a presence in these states, but it has yet to really penetrate them, has yet to win a lot of seats, is emerging, has the number two competitors in some of these states. But these are states that are already dominated by regionalist parties, particularly in the south. And that does not give a lot of prospect. And these are seats that they are currently holding. So that does not give a lot of prospects of, winning new seats. And the problem of the alliance is that in the crucial states where Congress and BJP are, face to face, regional parties from the alliance can do very little to support or improve even the prospect of Congress in those states. I mean, the DMK from Tamil Nadu, the Trinamool from West Bengal can do very little objectively to help Congress in Madhya Pradesh or Rajasthan or UP or other such states. So they're really constrained by their lack of cohesion, by their lack of program, and by geography itself.
Right. And it's also interesting when you look at a map of India as to the states that are ruled by, let's say, non-BJP parties. A huge chunk of them, like, for instance, the YSRC in Andhra Pradesh and the Biju Janata Dal in Orissa, one would think that because they're not necessarily supporting the BJP, they're not BJP allies, they would have more to gain and a lot more power, considering they, actually ruled states by being part of this India alliance. But they don't seem to want to do much with them. Well, how do you explain that phenomenon?
Well, yeah, that's the third, limiting factor is that the India alliance, as you say, does not contain all of the opposition. And in some key states or important states, you have important parties who have chosen to remain, say, non-aligned. And that's illustrative of the fact that regional parties, both within and outside the India alliance, will always privilege their regional interest to a national campaign. The seat of power, the source of power of these parties are the hold that they have over their states or regions. And they will never sacrifice that hold for any kind of national campaign. And so it leads some regional parties currently in power in their states, in Orissa, in Andhra Pradesh, you just mentioned, to basically sit out from the alliance and actually even make some kind of arrangement with the BJP that we don't throw too much of a challenge, or we don't bother you in national politics, and you don't throw too much of a challenge against us in state elections. But even within the India alliance, regional and regionalist parties tend to have the same attitude. They, for a variety of reasons, consider Congress to be a toxic alliance partner, in the sense that every time regional parties have allied with the Congress in recent years, the Congress has sort of pulled down the performance of the alliance. Vote transfers seem to not take place at the same rate towards Congress candidate than the other way around. And so regional parties have been reluctant to, leave space to the Congress party. I mean, Mamata Banerjee in West Bengal is not giving any seats to the Congress party. And so that, of course, diminishes the prospect of the Congress as a whole. And that's yet another factor of weakness.
Right. And aside from all the internal cohesion struggles, there's also the question of the external forces that might limit the India alliance's performance. And with that, I want to bring us to the sort of delicate question about the fairness of this election. We've seen recently that a very notable opposition leader, Arvind Kejriwal, the sitting chief minister of Delhi and a member of the AAP, which is part of the India Alliance, was arrested. I don't think the charges have been proven, but he's sort of taken in pre-verdict detention. And we've seen across India, in my home state of Maharashtra, for instance, no less than two of the parties opposing the BJP have been split in half, and the factions that support the BJP are recognized as the party, legitimate party. We have all these underhanded, in my opinion, underhanded tricks being played. To what extent do you think this is a fair, level playing field for the members of the India Alliance?
Well, that's the key question, really. How free and fair Indian elections are today. When you consider the question of, free and fair character of elections, you can split it into two aspects. One is the conduct of the election, the role of the ECI, the logistics, the actual voting. And then you have the question on free and fair competition, which India no longer seem to have, not only by virtue of the strength and dominance of the BJP, or the centrality of the BJP and the fragmentation of the opposition, but because the BJP uses and even abuses of its dominant position to create undue advantages by using tax and security institutions, by creating legal complications to the opposition members and leaders, by exerting a control of the media, particularly traditional but also electronic media, by saturating the public sphere with the image of the prime minister using public resources and private resources, rendering the opposition quite invisible. And so you have poaching members and cadres and leaders of other parties, bringing down 5 democratically elected government since 2014 by basically poaching or providing financial incentives to opposition representatives. And so when you put all these practices, not all of them illegal, but most of them morally dubious, when you put them, all together, it depicts a picture of an unfair fight. The concentration of resources, the whole discussion we've had in India in the recent weeks about electoral bond, basically revealed what most of us knew already, that you have a hugely skewed system of political funding that favors the BJP. The BJP, with electoral bond alone, has 5 times more resources than its immediate adversary, the Congress Party. And that's only one aspect of one form of electoral funding among several others. And so, yes, indeed, when you put all this together, when you combine all these factors together, that does not depict a free and fair competition.
Right, and especially the electoral bonds case has been quite revealing in terms of the disproportionate financial resources that the BJP has, aside from all the other shenanigans, to use my word, is they're pulling. But like I mentioned in the introduction, one interesting aspect about an Indian election is there's so many different local factors to consider. For example, the caste matrix, the religious dimension of it. You've done some really stellar work on the political caste matrix in India, especially in Uttar Pradesh. And if they don't have financial resources or other electoral advantages, do they have perhaps regional and caste strengths, the India Alliance, as compared to the BJP, that can possibly be a source of strength for them?
Yeah, that's a great question. To win elections in India today, you need to build a cross-caste appeal. There's absolutely no doubt about that. The politics of the 90s, where political parties sort of concentrated on their core support base, defined roughly around caste lines at the exclusion of others. I mean, those days really are gone. No party can afford, not to try to sort of broaden the array of castes that they seek to represent. And so as a result, the caste-based strategies of parties have become, somewhat similar across parties. If you look at the regionalist parties of the South that are dominant in their own states, these are parties that seek to defend a regional identity that cuts across caste. Obviously, there are equations in Tamil Nadu, in Kerala, and obviously in Karnataka as well. But parties that succeed develop cross-caste appeal. The problem of the Congress is that it has lost support across every group. In a way, the Congress Party is a party that doesn't represent anyone in particular, while the BJP receives extremely cohesive support from particular segments of the population, particularly the upper caste. Upper caste since the 90s have been, massively in favor of the BJP, but now it has achieved a degree of, cohesiveness and solidity that we've not seen before. Above 80% of upper caste in UP voting for the BJP. And then the BJP has succeeded in increasing support amongst groups that didn't used to support it before, or did only so very episodically, particularly the lower OBCs, particularly the Dalits. And they do that by articulating the different tropes that I've mentioned before, nationalism, Hindu nationalism, and welfare, but with a form of inclusion which still rely on the notion of caste, and building these sort of symbolic, if not token, partnership with, micro parties that have a strong caste identity is a way to sort of send a signal about, how inclusive they are. But by and large, every party does the same kind of caste arithmetic. They all tend to privilege candidates who come from groups that are demographically or politically dominant within their constituency. Everyone claims to be, some sort of a social rainbow coalition. But I'm struck by the fact that these insistence on caste diversity, both within the BJP but also other parties, come at the same time where politics becomes more and more centralized both within parties and within governments, concentrated, and also authoritarian. So one really has to ask, what is the meaning of this inclusion when politics is more and more centralized and personalized, and in a way, much less democratic than it used to be.
Right, but do you not see some? And I understand there's this trend towards increasing centralization and authoritarianism, and also that both the BJP and the Congress, the dynamic of caste isn't perhaps as vivid as it was in the 90s, let's say. I recall during the Karnataka election, I think it was specifically because the BJP had lost favor within a certain caste. I believe it was Lingayat. That was one of the factors that caused them to lose the next election. And I can also see in places like Maharashtra, there's certainly, let's say, dissension amongst the Maratha caste, which are like the dominant political caste. So do you not see these sort of caste loyalties in some areas breaking up that unified messaging or unified strategy that the BJP is trying to bring to fore? And couldn't that be used by the opposition in some way?
Yeah, these electoral support by major castes are somewhat breaking up also because inequalities or within those castes have considerably increased. There's a lot of really great work done by Kalera San and Christophe Jaffredo that shows how economic disparity within caste has increased considerably across the country. So castes themselves are not as politically cohesive as what they used to be. So in the north, that's internal diversity among castes does not really affect support for the BJP given its degree of popularity. But in other states, and you mentioned those states in the south, in Maharashtra, that does play a role, right? I think what remains is that caste-based strategies of political parties tend to be micro. It's really at the constituency level. When you are a political party in Karnataka, the degree of dominance of Lingayats in the north of the state is such that no party can really afford not nominating a lot of Lingayats. And so the profile of Congress party versus BJP are not fundamentally different. The one difference obviously is minority representation within the Congress party, which is somewhat inexistent, within the BJP. If I remember correctly, in 2019, 23% of Congress candidates belonged to some kind of religious minority, while the BJP did not field any and got elected any Muslim MP. So that's really the major difference. But otherwise, and I've been saying this for a while, sociologically speaking, Congress and BJP, especially in northern India, are not sociologically differentiated.
Interesting. And I wasn't aware actually about the inequalities, the within caste inequalities becoming an important factor that undermines caste consolidation. That's fascinating.
Yeah, that's what's that's what's driving the protest movements among Patels, among Marathas, among Jats. It's driven by inequalities within these groups, right? And some of them are not at the economic level that they thought they should be, given their otherwise state of caste dominance, and they're protesting. They want jobs, they want better opportunities, they want to be equal to their peers, and that leads to mobilization, which of course have political repercussions.
So most of my questions here have been treating caste and religious consolidation as if these weren't constituting of individual voters, but rather they act as unified blocks. But as we've seen in Indian elections, that may not be as true as it was in the earlier times. So could you talk about the behavior of the individual voter and how that might change or defy traditional calculations in terms of caste and religious consolidation in Indian elections?
So here it's interesting because we do have data on electoral behavior. So we know how voters by and large have voted in past elections. But we've not been able to, we political scientists, we've not been able to derive a voting theory out of it that is basically any element of predictability. There's a lot that we don't know about electoral behavior in India, but something that we do know is that there's still a great deal of volatility in how people vote. So the decoupling of performance of parties, particularly the BJP, between state and national elections, for example, comes from the fact that a lot of voters have no difficulties voting for one party in one election and another in a different election. We know that a lot of voters change their votes between from one election to another. That ratio is actually quite high. And that tells us that voters are not that solidly tied to political parties as we sometimes think they are. And so we talk about, vote banks when you talk about politics. I think it's a term that we should sort of discard because if anything, electoral politics is looks more like a volatile electoral market rather than stacks of voters solidly and stacked in Swiss bank accounts and very dormant. So so we see a lot of movement, and therefore that provides an element of unpredictability to Indian elections. And that's the one redeeming factor in all this gloom, is that at the end of the day, it's really voters who determine electoral outcomes. And in the past, they have thrown major surprises. 2004, of course, comes to mind, but also the rise of new parties like AAP and Aam Aadmi Party and its victory, for instance, in Punjab. These are not things that we could have predicted and which were really voter-induced. So there's always space for surprises, and that's the one redeeming factor about Indian elections at the moment.
Right. So we saw with the inauguration of the Ram Mandir in Uttar Pradesh, which has been a BJP promise and a mainstay issue since at least the 90s. And with that coming through in the recent months, as well as news of demands for a caste census that especially the opposition parties are trying to push, there seems to be, not exactly, but some sort of a resurgence in the whole Mandal versus Mandir debate, which dominated India in the late 80s and the 90s. I just spoke to Ashutosh Varshney in our last podcast, and he talked about how the BJP was trying a strategy where they try to consolidate on religious lines. So they try to consolidate the Hindu caste together while excluding Muslims, and that was one of their themes for a long time, or strategies for a long time. But with these protests coming in from different caste bodies, with the obviously terrible job situation in India right now, and one of the main demands for caste censuses and caste representation is reservation of jobs in public bodies, universities, etc. Do you see a revival in caste versus religious fault lines that used to be more preeminent in India in the 80s and 90s? And maybe you could just explain to our listeners this debate of Mandal versus Mandir and how that sort of might play out in the next few campaigns in Indian elections.
So the large picture answer to that question is that Mandir politics or temple politics is a central tenet of Hindu nationalist campaign in politics and aims at unifying Hindus under one broad, religious label. Caste, on the other hand, is a factor of division, heterogeneity, fragmentation among Hindus, and focus on the question of redistribution and balance of power between castes and economic disparities. And so the clash really is between these two visions. I mean, do you cater to the needs of the marginalized segment of the population, or do you articulate politics around an all-encompassing Hindu nationalist category that excludes minority? So these have been somewhat, the major line of division, political division, in particularly in northern India, from the early 90s onwards, when the BJP rose for the first time. That being said, that distinction is a bit simplistic in the sense that one does not necessarily come at the cost of the other or the exclusion of the other. The strength of the BJP has been to somewhat integrate Mandal politics within its larger Mandir politics, in the sense that the discourse is each caste is welcome and should have representation within the larger Hindu family. So they've tried very hard to make these two registers of politics compatible. They focus in their campaigns and in their electoral strategies on groups that have been historically, politically marginalized, that are not part of the traditional support base of their adversaries, particularly in UP. And so there's a lot of caste rhetoric and castes and management of castes within electoral campaign and strategies. So the strength of the BJP has been to try to make these two registers compatible with one another, saying that there is space for everyone, but within a larger Hindu family, which is led by a central figure who himself belongs to the backward classes. So that sort of blurs the line of division between those two tropes. And the India Alliance is sort of banking on the kind of caste-based politics that made, the success of regional parties now 30 years ago. But it's not clear that doing it alone and not in conjunction with other powerful political tropes, it's not clear that it is still as politically salient or effective as it used to be. I think if you ask around, and there's been surveys have been done around these questions, most people view rather favorably a caste census. They understand why it might be useful and they understand why it might be necessary. But in and of itself, it's not sufficient to, stir the imagination of voters. And that in part explains why this idea of a caste census, while popular, does not necessarily translate into electoral gains. On the other hand, the BJP has been very successful at transforming the infrastructure of social justice and welfare policy in India, using technologies to and reforms to target individuals as recipient of state welfare, rather than using caste as an intermediary notion to do so. And by doing so, they have removed intermediaries, they have increased efficiency, and they have created a system of redistribution that's also personalized, because the face of the prime minister is literally stamped on everything. And so they managed to draw a lot of credit for what used to be mediated by caste politics, right? So in total, it's a rather complex picture in which the BJP seeks to combine elements of Mandir and Mandal, and the opposition relies on Mandal but not much else to compete against the BJP.
Right, and I suppose it's somewhat difficult to execute an election campaign when the BJP has already taken possible areas of strength and perhaps managed to do them better in terms of welfare distribution.
That's right.
So let's talk about the upcoming election. It's going to start next month, go on till May, and we're going to have results out by end May, early June. The BJP does look likely to emerge as definitely the single largest party, possibly with a majority. The question is, how effective can this grand opposition India alliance be in denting their majority? What do you think are the prospects for the India Alliance against the BJP? And in particular, maybe you could talk about the states or the constituencies to maybe look out for in terms of where you might see the most decisive action.
As we've discussed, the BJP stacks up most, advantages in these elections, and it's hard for anyone to see how the India Alliance will succeed to, dent into it sufficiently. Another way to look at things is to say that the BJP, after all, doesn't have such a huge majority, right? They currently have 55% of the seats, which of course is very significant and a comfortable majority, but it's not a two-third majority like Rajiv Gandhi had in the 80s. And so losing a few seats here and there might be enough to make the BJP lose its majority. I think at this point, the best hope for the opposition would be to make the BJP lose its own majority, which it could compensate for with partners, allies, bringing some of the non-aligned parties. So I think the prospects of the BJP losing the election together is really, really slim. But it would be a symbolic victory, an important symbolic victory to make the BJP lose its majority. And for that, it has to be dented where it is currently dominant, which is the Hindi belt, where it currently holds nearly 70% of the seats. And some of those remaining seats are actually held by partners in Bihar or UP. So as long as you don't change that equation, the statistics that I've mentioned at the beginning, the strike rate of the BJP versus Congress, things are unlikely to change much. So in terms of states, which states are to be followed, every state becomes important because the BJP has to maintain a degree of dominance in the north, which we haven't seen, since the heydays of the Congress in the 50s and the 60s. And so the challenge for the BJP is to retain its base while, conquering new seats elsewhere, which is not an easy thing to do.
So just as an interesting sort of side to that, the BJP has a lot of space to lose in terms of because they've been so dominant. I believe they had a clean sweep in or near clean sweeps in Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan. Uttar Pradesh is obviously a state that they've recently started dominating. The question is, and they can lose there, and they can always reduce seats. The question is, what new areas of expansion does the BJP really have? I mean, they've tried in Bengal. They've been trying for a long time in the south with not much success outside Karnataka. If the BJP had to recompense seats it might lose in North India and other areas, where do you think those areas might even be?
So, areas of expansion for the BJP have been the east and the northeast. They've built up a presence they absolutely did not have in the past. And while it's, of course, important for the BJP, that does not yield a lot of seats in parliament. Outside Assam, most of the northeastern states are basically one or two seats states. The key state for the BJP is certainly West Bengal, where in 2019 it obtained about 40% of vote share, which was considerable. It did not translate into many seats because the election was actually quite bipolar. Both Congress and the Communists collapsed, and it was really a Trinamool versus BJP elections, and the Trinamool prevailed. A lot has happened in West Bengal since. Mamata Banerjee is not on a position of strength as she used to be. There's more and more contestation. There's more and more concern about electoral violence at the hand of the party in power in the state. But on the other hand, Bengal is a strange state for the BJP because it's the one state where its own organization is in complete disarray. They basically build a presence by poaching leaders and party workers from other parties, including the Communists, including the Congress and the Trinamool. And when they lost the elections, all these people basically went back to their original parties, and the BJP was quite surprised by that. So West Bengal really offers the best prospect, but it's also the but the state where the BJP is, the least organized or the most disorganized. So that makes it an interesting election. Then we have to look at states where the BJP is in a number 2 position, but hasn't succeeded yet in building up or gaining a lot of seats. So Orissa, of course, is one of them, and that's another area where it could gain a couple of seats. Then there are states that are highly unpredictable and competitive. Your own state of Maharashtra. I don't think I understand Maharashtra politics anymore.
I don't either. Exactly.
It's a bit very honest. It's between parties splitting, coalitions, governments collapsing, and the reorganization of the political space in Maharashtra is very, very chaotic. And so maybe the BJP and Shiv Sena alliance and the sort of NCP alliance will manage to pull out something, but we're really looking at a few seats here and there, right? We're not necessarily talking about sort of virgin territory where the BJP could sort of storm and conquer and sweep like they have in northern India. So the scope for the BJP to increase is actually not that great. The one way it could increase is if the Congress and some of its key partners somewhat collapsed even more in the election, and that. But we don't know if that's coming. So if I'm not a betting person, and I'm neither an economist or an astrologer, so I'm always wary with prediction. But I would expect the overall balance of power to be not fundamentally different from what it is now, because there is not that much space for the BJP to conquer.
Right. And it's very telling that you mentioned that the 3 kinds of people who predict Indian elections are gamblers, astrologers, and economists, which I suppose is a testament to the chaos of Indian elections. And just to clarify,
and they all they're all pretty bad at it.
Yeah. Just to clarify for our listeners, right now in my state of Maharashtra, which is the second largest state, there are currently 2 Shiv Senas, there are 2 NCPs, which itself was a breakaway party from the Congress, and then there's a BJP that's trying to break all of them together. So it's a nightmare. But Professor Gilles Vanier, through this chaos, thank you for restoring a bit of order and understanding in our listeners. It's going to be a very interesting election, and while Modi's third term is predicted, I think you've inserted a little piece of doubt into whether or not that majority can be retained, which is very interesting. But thanks so much for joining the podcast.
You're very welcome.
And that's all we have time for this month's episode of Beyond the Indus. I hope you found that as insightful and interesting as I did. And join us next month for our final episode in our Road 24 series, where we'll be dissecting the Indian election as it's happening on the ground. So until then, take care and bye.